In 2004, a murder trial in the United States came to a halt. A defense attorney stood up and quoted a single line from the Bible, 4 words. "Judge not," he said. "That is what Scripture commands." The courtroom went silent. Now, whether that argument worked or not isn't really the point. The point is this: that same argument has been made millions of times, in kitchens, in offices, in churches, online, by people who have never read what comes next. Because what comes next changes everything. This might be the most quoted verse in the entire Bible. It's used to shut down criticism, to avoid accountability, to argue that no one has the right to say anything is wrong. But if you keep reading, just 3 more sentences, you discover something almost no one talks about. Jesus didn't forbid judgment, he redefined it. To understand what Jesus meant, we need to understand where he was, who he was speaking to, and what the world around him looked like. The year is roughly 30 AD. The place is a hillside in Galilee, near the town of Capernaum. Jesus has begun drawing large crowds, ordinary people, farmers, fishermen, tradespeople, and he sits down and begins to teach. This teaching becomes known as the Sermon on the Mount, recorded in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. It is the longest recorded teaching of Jesus in any gospel, and scholars have debated its contents for 2,000 years. But here's the critical piece of context that most people skip. Jesus was speaking in a world dominated by a religious and political group called the Pharisees. The Pharisees were experts in Jewish law, deeply educated, publicly respected, and enormously influential. And they had developed a very specific culture around moral judgment. Public moral correction was a mark of status. It signaled piety, learning, superiority. If you could identify someone else's sin clearly and loudly in the marketplace, at the city gate, in the synagogue, it demonstrated that you were righteous. The problem was that this culture had become less about helping people and more about elevating oneself. Judgment had become performance, and that is exactly the world Jesus is speaking into when he says, "Judge not." Now here is where the original language becomes fascinating. The word translated as judge in English comes from the Greek word krino, and krino is a legal term. In the Greek-speaking world of the 1st century, krino was the language of courtrooms and formal verdicts. It described the act of rendering a final authoritative judgment, the kind a magistrate delivers at the end of a trial. So when Jesus says, "Judge not," he is not saying, "Never form an opinion." He's not saying, "Pretend you cannot see right from wrong." He's saying something far more specific. Stop issuing final verdicts on people. Stop acting as though you are the ultimate authority on another person's soul. That one word, krino, narrows the meaning considerably. And it makes what Jesus says next make perfect sense. Right after saying, "Judge not," Jesus tells a story. And it is deliberately absurd. Imagine someone trying to remove a tiny speck of dust from another person's eye, while they themselves have a giant wooden plank, a full beam of timber, sticking out of their own. It would have made the crowd laugh. The image is almost slapstick. But the humor is deliberate, because it makes the lesson impossible to forget. Jesus asks, "Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but pay no attention to the plank in your own?" And then, and this is the part that changes everything, he gives a clear instruction. First, remove the plank from your own eye. Then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Then, Jesus is not saying don't help your brother. He is not saying ignore the speck. He is saying the order matters. Self-examination first, help second, humility before correction. This brings us back to the Pharisees, because what Jesus is exposing here is not judgment itself. He is exposing hypocrisy. Hypocrisy happens when we hold others to standards we don't apply to ourselves, when we scrutinize others while remaining blind to our own failures, when moral correction becomes a performance rather than an act of care. The Pharisees had made an art form of this, and Jesus had watched it, and he is calling it out directly in front of the people they had been judging. But notice that Jesus doesn't say the Pharisees were wrong to care about right and wrong. He says they were wrong about where to start. You cannot perform moral surgery on someone else when you haven't examined yourself first. The plank in your own eye will distort everything you think you see. And if there were any doubt about whether Jesus was abolishing all moral judgment, the rest of the New Testament makes it clear that he wasn't. In his letters, the Apostle Paul warns repeatedly about false teachers. He tells communities to correct harmful behavior within their gatherings. He instructs believers to practice discernment, to test what is true. The early church was not a community that suspended all moral judgment. They made judgments constantly. But the condition was always the same. Do it with humility. Do it with self-awareness. Do it to restore, not to condemn. Paul writes in Galatians, if someone is caught in wrongdoing, those who are spiritual should restore that person gently, while watching themselves so that they also may not be tempted. Gently. Watching themselves, that is the spirit of Matthew 7. That is what Jesus was pointing toward. So the next time someone quotes "judge not" to end a conversation, you now know what the full passage actually says. Jesus was not abolishing discernment. He was reforming the attitude behind it. He was calling people away from the performative, self-elevating moral judgment of the Pharisees and toward something much harder: honest self-examination, genuine humility. Correction that begins with compassion, not condemnation. The verse doesn't say, never judge. It says, look at yourself first. And when you understand the world Jesus was speaking into, the Greek word he chose and the illustration he used to make his point, the meaning isn't ambiguous at all. Context changes everything.